Welcome. Danira, would you please have the webinar go live? Thank you. Welcome to the Child Welfare Information Technology System Managers and Staff webinar series, brought to you on behalf of the Health and Human Services Administration for Children and Families, Children's Bureau. Today's roundtable discussion features a distinguished panel from Arizona, Idaho, and Nick Gumper, our technology systems expert. Both Arizona and Idaho will discuss their experiences and journey with cloud computing service models. My name is Nick Moser, and I'm your host for today's discussion. I want to thank our panelists for their time and effort in preparing for this roundtable. So let's meet them, beginning with our team from Arizona.
Hello, my name is Linda Roberts. I'm the Chief Information Officer for the Department of Child Safety, and with me I have Jay Klein.
I'm the Infrastructure Architect and Cloud Architect at the Department of Child Safety in Arizona.
Thank you, and next, let's have our team from Idaho introduce themselves.
My name is Greg Kuntz. I am the Strategic Business Office Manager, a new office created to look at solutions across our entire state agency. And with me is
Chris Jensen, and I'm the Child Welfare Project Manager here in Idaho.
And lastly, let's have Nick Gumper introduce himself.
Hi, everyone. I'm Nick Gumper from ICF. I'm a consultant to the Children's Bureau, and I provide architecture and security advice.
Thank you. So next, for a little bit of housekeeping. Attendees are encouraged to participate in the roundtable with questions or comments. All of the participant lines are muted now. If you called in on a phone, please select Leave Computer Audio to avoid audio feedback on both computer and phone. There will be periodic question and answer sessions throughout this presentation. And please be aware that you can submit questions at any time using the chat feature, and those will be queued up once we get to those Q&A sessions. If you wish to ask a question over the phone, you may select the raise hand icon next to your name in the participants list. Once today's roundtable is ended, you may submit additional questions to cwis.questions@acf.hhs.gov or to your federal analyst. So now I want to give you a feel for the flow of our webinar. First, we are going to do a quick recap since this webinar is a follow-up from our presentation in December, and that will be led by Nick Gumper. He's going to explain briefly the differences between infrastructure as a service, platform as a service, software as a service, and also commercial off-the-shelf software. Then we will transition to a discussion from our state teams about their individual journeys regarding cloud computing service models. And lastly, we will transition to a series of questions, many of which we prepared in advance. Others, we're looking for participation from our audience members and attendees. Let's now transition to a recap. So I'm going to have Mr. Gumper take it away with a brief explanation of the differences between the varieties of cloud service models out there.
Sure, thank you. So what we talked about in December is the distinction between infrastructure as a service, platform as a service, and software as a service. In particular, infrastructure as a service basically allows for the provisioning or based, typically virtualized computing resources. Those would include such things as virtual machines, networks, and data storage. Platform as a service, in turn, typically resides on top of underlying infrastructure, and it allows for the creation of applications as existing managed applications, middleware, frameworks, etc. And finally, software as a service are typically fully functional applications. They may require some configurations, but basically they're aimed at end users. Now, commercial off-the-shelf is listed here. insofar as a software as a service application can be considered commercial off-the-shelf products. In the COTS product basically encompasses anything, any commercial software that's sold in substantial quantities, and where what's offered in, to the government is equivalent to what's offered on the commercial market.
Thank you. Quick interruption, I apologize, Nick. I just wanted to express a general apology to folks on the phone. We understand that some individuals are hearing some auditory interference, and so we just want to apologize for that. We're doing our best to address it. So Nick, next, can you tell us a little bit more about some of the other flavors of as a service that are out there?
Sure. As I'm sure we'll, find out as the states discuss some of what they've implemented in their plans, many of these cloud service computing models, there's some gray areas between them. There's no clear distinction between what is platform as a service and what is software as a service in all cases. Likewise, there's been this huge proliferation of services, sometimes called X as a service or anything as a service. Things like APIs for consuming RESTful web services, data as a service. There's these variety of anything as a service computing models that have proliferated, and they conform to varying degrees to the overall three models of infrastructure as a service, platform as a service, and software as a service.
Thank you, Nick.
Sure.
Next, let's transition to state panelists, and they can talk about their journeys. We'll start with the state of Arizona, please.
All right. This is Jay. So this is the current architectural map that lays out most of the high-level information that we're looking at when we're implementing what we're referring to as the Guardian information. Okay. So at the core of this, and obviously you can see right in the center, is really built around using Dynamics, specifically in O365, so platform as a service. Now all of this, where applicable, I also should say, is sitting inside Microsoft's government infrastructure, so Azure government. Dynamics is inside their government tenant as well. These things can be done on commercial side. We chose government because of the type of data and security that we need. On the right-hand side, there's a lot of things listed here. So a lot of acronyms, unfortunately, some of them might not be too needed outside the state, but these are different interfaces that Guardian is planning on having. These are data exchanges. So we're going to have data coming in and out of the system through lots of different agencies, healthcare information, social security information, information about lots of children around the state through Department of Education and courts information. All of these are coming in through potentially lots of different types of functions. Some of them are going to be using SFTP services, which are going to be hosted inside virtual machines. So that infrastructure as a service inside our Azure government environment. Some of these are direct API connections. So we're using, again, inside Azure API management to build the direct connection to the other state systems so we can exchange the required information. Some of these are using actual other VMs that are doing things like IBM MQ services. So we really have to match up what we're building inside our infrastructure to what these other state environments are using. And this is where we really need the flexibility of something like Azure as a platform to build this functionality so we can provide VMs, APIs to run all the different services and potential options necessary to allow that information to be exchanged correctly. Now, some of the things that you'll see listed around Dynamics, I'm trying to find it up here, sort of up at the top, we have two major aspects that kind of look like they're within our environment, but they're not. Specifically, I'll call out OnBase and DocuSign. So we're trying to put everything as much as possible inside a cloud hosted style infrastructure. OnBase is hosted at Highland, and it is basically what we're using as enterprise document management. So all of the information for case file information, PDFs, all the documents that are going back and forth, OnBase is being used as that repository. Dynamics is the front end. and all that information is then sent to OnBase. DocuSign, well, they're very well known for what they do, so anything that we require to have digital signatures, e-ink, those types of things, we can have and call on DocuSign to allow that. In front of this, we have a lot of the standard infrastructure style environments that a lot of times you normally use on-prem. So identity management obviously being a big one. In the top left, you'll see we've got Azure B2C, Azure AD, and Active Directory. These are our three main identity management stores, so that when people authenticate into Guardian, their IDs, their usernames and passwords have to be stored somewhere. For internal users, Active Directory, right? So we can control passwords, we can control account lockouts, we can audit that information as necessary. But what we don't prefer to have in our system, and this can be changed for lots of different places, is external entities. So a lot of the places that we use to contract certain options, such as we call them providers, we don't necessarily want them inside our internal Active Directory. We prefer to keep them slightly separated. For that, Microsoft, in this case, because we're using Azure, has an option called Azure B2C. This allows kind of that business to consumer aspect where I can host those accounts in a separate area. They still have a username, they still have a password, we still manage them, but they're not internal usernames and passwords. So they don't have access to anything out of the box unless what we allow them to, specifically through Dynamics. Other options that we're putting inside here, we have InRule, which is a third-party product for a lot of rules management. So when people come through and they need to provide options in terms of doing specific types of assessments and say, hey, when somebody's out in the field and they need to say, well, I'm in this type of situation, we're dealing with these types of environments, InRule can kind of help them come up with a decision to say whether or not the type of action that they should take in that specific environment. One of the big things that we're actually working on right now is those red components down below, and the colors here are mainly just for our internal purposes. This is just a document I had at the time. But we've got three things. One is the ODS. This is the operational data store. This is the main SQL, or in this case, SQL environment that we're using to send information from the other providers, everybody listed on the left, and then in and out of Dynamics. Then we also have the data warehouse sitting there, which is then going to be sort of that back-end repository for all of the information that the ODS is dealing with. And then Power BI, again, hosted through Microsoft O365, is going to be our main reporting services off of this. The data warehouse and the ODS was something that we spent a lot of time on kind of figuring out how we're going to do this, because this is dealing with lots of data. Normally, when you're dealing with SQL, you're dealing with things like always on availability sets, lots of redundancy. This is core information. Well, trying to take that, which is a standard environment years ago, and shifting it into a cloud environment, we now have SQL as a service. So we've been weighing these options out and found that going SQL as a service really provided us a lot of benefits in terms of reducing the amount of management that we're going to have to deal with this. We can actually focus more on the structure of the data, the ability to have that fail over in ways that we never would have been able to do if we were running this through standard virtual machines, and at the same point in time, actually the overall cost of it. So those types of things we actually spent quite a bit of time on figuring out which option was best. And then for a lot of the other things, and I'm going to try to go through this relatively quick. I could spend a lot more time, obviously, there's a lot here. But for monitoring specifically, to make sure that all of these components, be it an Azure component, be it an OnBase Highland component, a Dynamics 365 component, we need to obviously make sure that these things are up, running, performing as expected. So out of the box, we're using and leveraging a lot of the Microsoft Azure tools, specifically application insights, to gain performance metrics and operational metrics from Dynamics, which will then ingest into what's known as log analytics, which basically is a big event log collector. We are building all the queries and dashboards so we can pull out event information, error information, and performance-based information to ensure that moving forward, we can have proper incident management processes, report when things aren't performing correctly, and go through the proper escalation processes to standard operations teams, development groups, and whoever actually needs an alert that goes through. So that pretty much covers a high level.
Thank you so much, Jay.
Sure.
Linda, I apologize. It sounds like I interrupted you there a little bit.
No, I was just going to mention, while it seems like very clearly that we have a big blueprint, it took a lot of thought and a lot of knowledge to be able to determine the right services to spin up and use within our government environment to make Guardian possible. So, you know, not all services were available when we needed them, and like SQL PaaS, for instance, that is relatively new for us as we move into our implementation date in July. So there's a big process, and while Jay very eloquently kind of went through the big blocks of what our infrastructure and platform looks like, there's a definite onboarding process that we and other states will need to consider in your cloud journey as you onboard and determine what services are available, whether you're using Amazon or Azure.
Thank you. I think there was you two presented such great information there. We're going to take a quick pause and determine if any in the audience has any questions about your architecture or setup. As a reminder, if you wish to, go ahead, Nick.
Sorry, is it appropriate to ask it verbally, or do you want to ask questions through the interface?
Please go ahead. Verbally is always better.
Okay. So I guess my question is how you're defining currently the system boundary for your child welfare system, as opposed to other systems that may share some of the same resources, or do they?
Well, I guess we would need a little bit more context there. Most of these things that are going in place here are brand new and specific to Guardian. Obviously, there are certain infrastructure services, you know, Active Directory, Azure AD, those types of things that are leveraged through the entire organization. And we do also have things like log analytics and some of the Azure Sentinel for security options that go through, you know, our entire Azure platform. Those types of things, anything built inside Azure is very easy to kind of segment and sort of block together to use for specific components within Azure. Obviously, Active Directory and Azure AD, those are global services. You can't really segment those, you know, so much.
Sure.
They're just leveraged as needed.
And I would say we do use OnBase in our agency. Outside of what Guardian is. So we're able to leverage one hosting platform and be able to set up different groups and use different things like logic apps or API management to interface with different other platforms or applications that we need to.
And do you have an authorization process that's separated from your selection of services for Guardian? So, for example, if you're using OnBase or DocuSign, is that something that's done at the state level independent of Guardian, or was it done in the context of Guardian?
Well, a lot of the stuff that we did was actually a little bit of both. We went through you know, procurement processes that did involve you know, a state level, and we also went through procurement processes that were specific to the agency. And some things like OnBase, you know, we had kind of already had, so we just started leveraging it in a new way. You know, and in terms of, you know, kind of a process outside of procurement, one of the biggest things IT-wise for figuring out kind of how to use or what to use, you know, for this really comes down to obviously regulatory compliance and what data needs to be, you know, held in whatever component it may be, or whatever component is being used to exchange that data. So if we have stuff that's dealing with HIPAA, MARSI, Social Security type information, there's a very separate process and scrutiny that goes behind those to make sure that they're going to meet the regulatory compliance necessary. If it's not something that deals with those, and it's a component that might touch other data that doesn't have that level of scrutiny behind it, well, it is still obviously looked at to make sure it's a good fit. It doesn't nearly have the level of attention ones that do deal with that really sensitive data.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. As a quick reminder for our attendees, if you wish to ask a question over the phone, you may do so by selecting the raise hand button. It should be in the participants tab along the right side of your screen. If you wish to ask a question of our Arizona team via the chat box, you may do so just by typing it in. We'll probably wait 10 seconds or so to see if anybody has any follow-up questions for the team from Arizona, and if not, then we will move on to the state of Idaho. And we're going to go ahead to our team from Idaho. Thank you, Arizona.
So this is Greg, and I'm going to do just a quick intro to a couple of differentiating factors and some of the similarities with Arizona. I want to thank Linda and her team who, in some of our early design work for our journey, helped inform and educate us. So there are some similarities with Idaho. I do want to say that the textbook descriptions of infrastructure and platform and software as a service are within our solution very jumbled. The clarity of, the Dynamics 365 software as a service paid for in a subscription model, the Azure services that sits on top of the platform as a service and infrastructure as a service requires us to move back and forth between those models, both in finance and in our design strategies for our architecture. So we are somewhat similar, a couple of differences. Instead of using OnBase, we have Laserfish, but same sort of thing with our document management system. We use an Oracle rules engine that is an option for us, but we have yet to find the significant detail and complexity that would require that. We use Tableau as our BI tool rather than the Microsoft tool because the department had already purchased that as an enterprise tool and that was made available to us. Our strategy was to start a journey that had been talked about for years in Idaho, child welfare, and with some great support from the Children's Bureau, really had to push the boundaries at every single level. We had to push it at procurement because procurement, said cloud is dangerous and cloud is scary and we don't know cloud. So we had to get exemptions for those things we were doing. We had to learn what that looked like, and then the state has, after we pushed through some of those thresholds, come back and granted us some competitively procured services for Amazon and for Microsoft. But early on, we have very much learned how to do this by doing it. And we have a phased approach that we may talk about a little bit later in order to make all this work. And specifically, that phased approach is crucial for us in moving from our legacy system, which is called iCare here in the data layer, to our new cloud-hosted solution that we call SP. So in many ways, again, very similar, very much a proof of concept for the state of Idaho. We do hope that with this platform, this cloud infrastructure that we're building, other units within our state agency and other state agencies as well will help us make better use of the platform that we have with Microsoft. Now, we do have a couple of requirements as we go through this process, so it is a lot about reuse. We are trying to keep our costs low. We have an incredibly challenging measure from our legislature to make the ongoing operating costs as low as I can't even imagine what they're asking us to do. But we are making choices as we do our development work to make sure that our sustainability, our knowledge transfer is going on now so that we can have lower cost options to maintain the solution that we're building. So with that, I'm just going to let Chris, and we have two slides here, quickly talk about this slide and then we'll move to the next one. But you'll see a lot of similarity with the structure that Arizona has. Chris?
Yeah, so just to touch on this real quickly, starting at the top, I want to talk a little bit about who we view as the users. So in this case, it's our child welfare staff, as well as one of our future releases, we'll be putting the Dynamics portal in place that will be used by foster parents so that they can get access to information about the kids in their home or in their facility. And then finally, the administrative staff, for those that are there to technically administer the platform. So that's the view from the user perspective. The access layer that we're looking at is the browser-based. Chrome is what we standardized here in Idaho, at least for our child welfare application. Then the Dynamics mobile app will be used by child welfare staff as they're out and doing safety assessments, as an example. And then finally, the web service layer, as we talk about integration with some of the premise-based systems that we have or the external services that we've highlighted here on this chart. Some of the same acronyms that were on the Arizona's chart. And then just to jump into the kind of through the business layer there, we are leveraging many of the services within Azure, API management, the Logic apps as the key store, some of the same services that were talked about. And for us, really, and I'm going to touch on this real quickly, this really helps in that we had come from a different division within the department, and it really became difficult to kind of weave together the solutions into the various technical solutions into an overall application. So with Azure and with Dynamics, the list of technologies that have to be integrated are really narrowed, and we don't have to spend as much time making decisions around how solutions are going to be provided. So really has helped us kind of weave together the solution. That's on the Azure front. I would also talk about some of Exchange Server, we're using our existing Office 365 infrastructure for any of the email messaging that goes on. We've incorporated 3 components, Documents Core Pack, that we leverage for the notices that are being generated out of the ESPI is the name of our system. We decided to go that route instead of leveraging what Microsoft put forward in the Dynamics platform so that we could get more rich access to the entities within Dynamics. And then Solar, we've leveraged that for some of the search capabilities to extend what's in Dynamics for person search. And then North 52 is a component that we leverage. A lot of people talk about it kind of in the batch space, but it's much more an event-based. It looks for certain states within Dynamics and then drives or triggers events to occur. So that's why we felt it fit well in the batch space for it, kind of replaced some of the legacy systems that were out there. And just to drive down to the bottom layer there, we are using what we call eCabinet, but it's leveraging the Laserfish document management platform. And that same thing as Arizona with OnBase. Pre-existing, so we've got the department's IT infrastructure that's supporting that, and we're leveraging that in the solution. Tableau we're using for business intelligence. And then iCare, as Greg pointed out, is our existing legacy system. And we've not really highlighted it here, but we are, and we may drive into this a bit more, but we are leveraging a phased implementation. So we went live with our first intake module in June of last year. And then at the end we've got an additional 5 phases. At the end of the year, we'll finish that up. So we've got, there's a Kingsway soft that we're using for the synchronization and integration with our iCare system.
So we'll just stick on just this single view of our architecture and not go through the second slide. I think it's just important to understand that we feel that our phased approach was a really good way, as new as this was to us. The lessons that we learned in our phase one with intake, which was really simple and small, have really added value to our phased implementation of case management, which is going to happen here in just a couple of weeks. And again, our transition from our iCare legacy system, we are doing live data sync that keeps our legacy system in sync with our cloud system so that both systems will be working simultaneously. And I think that's a unique feature that allows us to minimize our risk with smaller releases and still, complete all the work that child welfare workers have to do. So we're going to leave that right here in terms of our architecture, and if there are some questions specific, we can handle those.
And if I could just real quickly interject, we are for this solution leveraging, and we would consider Dynamics 365 and SB kind of the software as a service, and then we've got infrastructure as a service for some of the virtual machines that are running Solar and Documents Core Pack, as well as platform as a service in some of the SQL databases that we're leveraging for both the data synchronization as well as ongoing access for our business intelligence, Tableau reporting.
Back to you.
Thank you so much for that. We're now going to take time to open up to questions from the audience or from fellow presenters as well. As a reminder, you may select the raise hand icon on the right side of your screen if you wish to ask a question on the phone, or you may enter a question in the chat box. It doesn't sound like we have any questions at this time. So with that, we're going to move on to our next portion of this webinar. And now I will transition over to Nicole Fuller, who's going to guide our prepared questions section.
Thank you, Nick. So I'd first like to open up with a question for Arizona. And the question is not one of the questions listed, but it was one that we just received. So Arizona, between your initial cloud computing vision and what is being implemented, what are the 2 or 3 things that you didn't know when you defined your initial vision that you learned over the course of the journey that may have caused you to revise or change your initial vision?
Linda responds.
Well, that's a big question. So let me make sure I understand. So, like, really, what was the difference of what I have implemented versus my initial vision and some of the things that we have learned? So, am I understanding that correct? Because there was a little bit
Absolutely.
of cutout. Sorry. Okay, good.
Yep.
So I will say overall, we started this journey about 5 years ago when we started building the business case. And in Arizona, we were kind of in a fortunate situation in which we were separating from another agency. So we had the opportunity to set up our IT in a greenfield kind of manner by choosing to go cloud first. So we knew that no matter what, we wanted to choose solutions that were cloud-based. The challenges with that vision is that services change so much, and the maturity of different providers, whether it's Azure or AWS, has also matured in what they allow in their government tenants versus commercial. So the options are getting more and more. I would say I would say from our initial vision, the vision really hadn't changed. We are actually able to execute against the vision. How we had to implement it probably changed based on the variety of services. So I can tell you, last year we were steadfast. So we have architectural review board every week. And at the time when we were onboarding and solidifying our architecture, SQL PaaS, so SQL Platform as a Service, was not a thought that we would be able to leverage that in the GovCloud, and now we are doing that before go live. So I will say, the fact that we wanted to use SQL, just the implementation of that is different. I would say that anybody starting out or kind of in the thick of their cloud journey, I will say, and I've said this, before, technology is never as slow as it is right now. If you don't have a solid way that you understand how to review and onboard the onslaught of services being offered, and how to incorporate that into your implementation plan, and how to get that into your own product lifecycle and management, like, spend some time to do that. Otherwise, all of the services and all that cloud computing has to offer, whether it's infrastructure, platform, or software, will be lost, I would say. Jay, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I mean, I think everybody kind of realizes, especially when you go cloud computing, that one of the things you're going to have to leverage more than you ever did prior with standard sort of on-premise infrastructure is the relationship with the vendor. It's people would say that you had a partnership with a vendor prior to cloud computing. You didn't have a partnership. You had a very loose relationship where you talked from time to time.
And you opened a ticket.
Exactly. This is now you really need, if you're going to implement the majority of your systems in a cloud-based infrastructure, and as Linda was saying, try to keep up on what's being done, you need an extremely tightly coupled partnership to the point where you're doing roadmap reviews with those vendors on a monthly basis. What is coming out? What do I have now? How can I leverage those things? When they change a functionality or service, if you're not aware that something's being deprecated, something's being changed, and you're using those options, if it's not well communicated to you and it comes up on you and you're not aware of it, all of a sudden now you're scrambling to fix these things. So that relationship and the ability to manage that relationship is just paramount in making sure that you're successful, not only implementing it, obviously, but moving forward with it. I mean, we've had numerous calls with Microsoft specifically discussing these exact options and sometimes our pain points with it. So, and they understand it, they get it, and this is where we're at now, where we do have constant phone calls, very dedicated people, monthly meetings to make sure that as we move forward, we're doing it in the proper manner and we're not just releasing something that is automatically out of date.
Thank you, Arizona. Idaho, we will ask you the same question, and our apologies if you're hearing some buzzing or some feedback on the line, but same question to Idaho. Can you tell us a little bit about what drove the difference of your initial vision and where you landed today?
Greg replies.
Yeah, and I think this is the beginning of, what have you really learned and might do differently if you could start all over again. Everything Arizona said, we totally agree with. We probably put those in some different frames. The government cloud really surprised us with our restrictions. We are worried about the speed in which they've come to us, but we had expectations for making changes faster, where the governing board really, we are waiting on the governing board for FedRAMP and the way in which Microsoft has implemented the government cloud. And we've really asked ourselves the question, have our security needs been managed as we need them to be managed with the government instance, or should we have looked at something else? So that's really challenged us us, not so much in the new things coming, but in the speed not being what we had hoped, and the maturity of that government cloud not being what we expected. And then just two other smaller things. Our third-party products are a constant learning experience for us. How we need to find another product that's not well represented in the suite that Microsoft offers or with Azure to complement. And sometimes with Microsoft, their comments back to us, this third-party product does this better than anything we will do for years, and you'll need to incorporate those. And we knew there'd be a few, but we have been surprised by the gaps that exist in the services that would require us to put a major component piece inside that solution. And finally, I think we expected, and this was probably naive on our part, that the business requirements gathering process, which is just standard, a tough thing to do, was challenging with our technical integrator and what they brought as modifications to the base that already was there in Dynamics. So they had built accelerators. And I think I would have expected and thought we should have done a better job in some of our original design phases, looking at the way in which their modifications to the out-of-the-box Dynamics affected our ability to make further customizations. We have an externally imposed requirement that we not customize more than about 20% of the out-of-the-box features, and that has caused us a lot of grief and pain. So I think it is really important when you talk about the government or the cloud hosting strategy to also think about what is this application going to be like, and where are you starting from, and where do you want to go, and really create some efficiencies in gathering those requirements. And again, that's a more universal thing than just the cloud journey, but we find it even more challenging than when we've done custom builds on-premise, where we're much more in control of the environment.
Thank you, Idaho. And thank you for both states for your transparency and just honest dialogue around this tough topic area. And so one more question as it relates to project management and governance, and it's the governance question itself. And so first to Arizona, can you tell us a little bit about your governance model, and if you've had to make changes to your governance model to fit the ongoing decision-making process that has to be made in a timely manner within cloud computing?
Yeah. So let me take a stab at that. So first, governance, you should have it. Second, I would say that we introduced first project governance. You know, did I have a good way to have a feedback loop when it came to understanding the business transformation that was having, the requirements that I was gathering, and making sure whatever solution we're building was able to be resolved with what we were building. So we have a pretty robust change control board, kind of inclusive for the agency of how we make changes. So there's some governance there. And then obviously our federal partners and our state partners keep us honest through the APD process and so forth. Are we building what we said we were building? Then there's the data governance. So we had to go through this maturity about IT doesn't own the data. IT needs to be in charge with, like you saw our infrastructure and our architectural model. There's enough for IT to be concerned with the security and the actual data model itself. Understanding how to use the data and what the data is used for, that real demarcation needed to reside in the business. So we had to, as part of this program, really get a data governance structure in where we had stewards and owners that defined what the retention rules were, that defined how the data would be used. That also has influenced whether or not we could use SQL PaaS, some of the rules that we needed around security. So having that constant data governance was key. And then the third piece was really that IT, that architecture board. So if our requirements were asking for something, and Idaho had mentioned this, and the requirement was asking for something to be customized. I would say, like a lot of the things that were coming out of finance, we went through an architectural review board, and that consisted of business and technical people. And if we could resolve it through configuration, through software as a service, through some other means where I had configuration and could reduce the complexity and technical debt, we made that decision. So all three, project governance, data governance, and technical governance, has really made a difference in the execution of this project.
Thank you, Linda, for that detailed response. Nick Gumper, are you there on the line? Nick Gumper had a question that he wanted to pose.
Yeah, this is more of a technical question than anything else, but I'm curious in terms of the degree to which you're looking at containerization as one of the options for your cloud environments, things like Kubernetes and such.
So I can speak to that from an Idaho perspective. We aren't, at this point, we're not leveraging that within the SB solution, but we are looking at one of the products that we're looking at that will enhance our monitoring capabilities is a Kubernetes containerized solution. So we are, as a department, moving down the path of containerization. Within the project, this SB solution that we're building has not been necessary, but is coming to bear.
Jay speaks.
Yeah, currently for Arizona, no, there's been nothing that either for Kubernetes or Docker containers that we've needed to leverage any of that against at this point. So as of right now, no.
Thank you. Actually, while I'm on, a quick question about automation and testing. To what degree do you have coverage for testing of the cloud services or your data interfaces with the cloud services?
In terms of like synthetic testing?
Yeah, but I mean, just in terms of even looking at functional testing, automated functional testing and so on.
I'll take that one for a moment. So we kind of look at we use Azure DevOps, and we also use this tool called Sonar Cloud to look at kind of our technical debt and our code coverage. From that, anything that and we have different types of testing. So whether we'll do buddy testing, then we'll do functional testing, then we'll do end-to-end testing, we'll do regression testing, and we'll do UAT testing. Those are like the big buckets. So anything that we've identified through that would require regression testing is where we are building these automated scripts. This was all part of the vision. I don't know that it necessarily I don't know that our decision around automated testing or the execution of that would have been different had we built a totally on-prem solution or not. It's just the way that it's the only way that we can manage such a system with so many different integration points and be able to keep up with the constant service changes that are happening. We have to automate some of the testing, especially when we look at regression.
Thank you.
Thank you. So we've received a question for Idaho through the question inbox. Idaho, can you please give an example of customization that you found or proved to be difficult based on the cloud computing solution that you selected for your state?
So I can take a general case. Do you have a specific one?
No, go for it.
Well, my general case, and this kind of plays with the role or the solution that our technical integrator brought, because we had some significant challenges with the child versus the parent versus the case model, and how we had features associated with each one of those entities, and how they were grouped and categorized, and then how those groups moved through a workflow. And where the challenge came was we had to redefine that workflow and redefine those entities and their hierarchy to something that was slightly different than what Deloitte brought to us, or that was available in the case management entities out of the box. So I look at that as being one of the most significant customizations, and I'm sorry I can't share more detail about that, but it is something that's going to haunt us through the remaining phases of our project, because we have to do that customization through our eligibility and our interfaces and our fiscal processing to make sure that we continue to customize from where we started in our base.
Well, I would add one other view, and I touched on this earlier, and that has to do with the decision that we made around Documents Core Pack and the costs associated to it, and the reasoning for that, the customization that was required, because we could not meet the need that the kind of out-of-the-box template-based reporting and dynamics could support. So I would say that's one of the areas where we've had to customize both from a budget, acquisition of third-party product, as well as the time it took to integrate that component, as well as build the supporting templates and documents for the reports that are, and notices that are coming out of the SB system.
Well, and I think this is a place where states that are getting bruised and, this pathway that we're following, we would not have chosen a different path in Idaho than the one we're on. But I think there are critical pieces that these platforms and the software as a service solutions like Dynamics are not as fully featured or as mature as we might have thought from the commercials. And I would say we should create those lists or categories where those are weak. And as Linda said earlier, or the Arizona team, those things are changing, and there are waves coming of changes to the base system that you have to be very attentive to. But when you start, there are some gaps in the platform that requires customization.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Does that answer the question?
It absolutely does. Thank you very much. So we'd like to open the floor for any last questions. We've got a few more topics to get through, but we are certainly okay with slowing down the cadence of this discussion to be sure that if there are any questions or discussion points that any of the participants on the line would like to pose, that we can address those. I think this is very healthy and very valuable conversation that we're having. Are there any questions? Please feel free to raise your hand, or you can always submit that question through the chat line. Okay, with that, Nick, we're going to move on to procurement. And so with that, Arizona, I'd like to ask you question number 1 that's presented there on the slide. Was the technology procurement a competitive process, or did you amend an existing state contractual agreement? And I'd like to just add on to that, if you could just talk a little bit about, excuse me, any challenges or any lessons learned that you would like to share as it relates to the procurement process itself.
Where do I begin with technology procurement challenges? So I will say on this, I will say we leveraged just about every type of procurement that we could. We went through a competitive RFP process. We have leveraged state contracts when they were applicable. We've used staff and like managed service kind of contracts. And throughout it all, I would say, and I can only speak from my experience in this procurement, because there were so many things to procure, and leveraging like our existing contracts, like our Microsoft EA, and like what did we want to competitively bid. At least in our state, in Arizona, procurement has not kept up with the demand and the challenge of how we need to think about procuring services and adding services for cloud computing. So I feel like I know that in order for us to get to the end result of Guardian, and we go live July 6th, that there were, we kind of had to fit in or figure out how we would procure and manage services based on the types of procurements that we had to make. And we had to get a little bit clever and work with our state procurement office, I would say. But we have a lot of work to do in our state to make sure that we can properly leverage the services as they come on, because I'll say it again, technology will never be as slow as it is right now. And we cannot spend 9 months in a procurement cycle figuring this stuff out. Like I could get away with it 3 years ago. I can't get away with it now. We have to get better, and this is the challenge that I have with the state.
Thank you, Linda. To Greg and Chris on the Idaho team, would you like to share anything about the procurement process in your experience, and maybe what you did not anticipate as it relates to procuring what you needed for your cloud computing solution?
Well, I would just like to put a exponential factor on what Linda said. Exactly the same thing. Our procurement was in no way ready for this. It was through some of the most complex and varied procurement processes that I've ever experienced in 30 years to get to this point. And our project is a business-driven project. So we drove these things not from what technology needed to be, but what the business wanted to do. And it has been a real challenge. And we've been granted exemptions because everyone thought we ought to be able to have it, but no one knew how to do it. So time and time again it was, well, if you think you can do that, describe it and we'll work with you. But many of our early procurements were based on exemptions, and some of our RFP work was some of the most contentious I've seen in a long time. Rival some of the MMIS procurements that have been in the past here in Idaho. So I don't know that I would say anything different than what Linda said, that she kind of described it very well, but we are two states that have had very similar experiences.
Yeah, I would
Thank
just
you.
add, if I could have mic dropped on my statement about how difficult procurement was, and it is not in our state, I would have. It is the competitive process behind, it is 10 years from where we need it to be in this state. And it's only going to get worse as technology moves faster.
Yep.
And to both Linda and Greg, one of the questions that we've received prior to this webinar was around, was your technology and some of those services purchased under your systems integrator contract? Was it separate through a third-party vendor? And if a third-party vendor was involved, were there any additional legal or liability concerns?
Well, go ahead, Linda.
Okay, I'll take this one. So we purposely separated out our platform and system integrator procurements. So it may have added time on the procurement process, but we purposely RFP just the platform itself without a technical or a systems integrator, so that we could leverage the buying power that the software would give us without it being tied to a vendor necessarily. And I would say, so no software or purchases other than people and capabilities were hired under the systems integrator contract. And then everything, the software pieces were all leveraged using different, either my platform contract, my mobile contract, or our existing enterprise contracts that I have with the state to purchase the things. So we really let the capabilities drive it from one procurement need and the software from another. I don't know if that's the right way to do it, but that's the way we did it.
Well, and this is Greg from Idaho. It's interesting because we did similar things as Arizona, but for slightly different reasons. We had so much fear of cloud that the only avenue we had for a cloud vendor was Microsoft, and we got a brand name exemption for that. The value that came was we were able to tap into the culture of Microsoft that already owned much of the state. And people could say, well, you know, you didn't really look competitively. We could not have moved on this project without finding something that already was acceptable within the state, and that was all there was. But on top of that, and to Linda's point too, this project is a really, we had limited funding, so we could not parse out large activities to vendors to do large-scale activities and pay for them managing that risk. So Idaho took on much of that ourselves, and I think much like Arizona, if I'm hearing this right, Linda, we bought those solutions and services piecemeal as we needed to through some complex processes, RFPs, invitations to bid, exemption criteria under 100K for this thing, pushing a limit and getting another procurement extension. So if the state had not done that, we think our costs would have been much higher. But it does require a lot of internal resourcing to be able to manage that, to pull it all together into a single solution.
Thank you, Greg. We do have a question that's come into the inbox. De Niro, I'd like for you to open the line for Robert Blanchard. Mr. Blanchard would like to add some commentary here.
Okay, Robert is now unmuted.
Great, thank you. Hi, I'm Bob Blanchard. I'm the Associate Director here at the Office of Child and Family Services, and I talked earlier to our federal partners, and I promised I'd share some information, and I have had some conversations with some other states, and I thought I could share a little bit of information that may be helpful here for procurement for states that are thinking about doing procurement of the cloud-based services. So like other states, we're moving forward with the change in the CWIS, and we're using a cloud-based solution using Salesforce as the platform, and Deloitte will be our integrator. And we're finalizing those contracts now. Really, for procurement, states really need to, what I found in my learning curve associated with these contracts was that that it is really important to separate the two. I think that really the challenge is, and it wasn't obvious at the beginning, but the challenge was, how do you hold providers accountable? And you want to be able to hold providers accountable to a contract, to an agreement that have specific deliverables that you'll be able to get what you want. And the farther away you are from a contract with a specific provider, so if you're using your integrator to purchase the platform software, you're an arm's width or arm's length away from that procurement, and it's going to be harder for you to hold responsibility, because whether or not your integrator can actually hold the software platform responsible becomes a challenge. So I would strongly agree with Idaho and Arizona in that the idea of making separate purchases are important. I would also point out that most of the platform providers will want to go through a third-party reseller of software, so like a Carasoft or something like that, which of course is again there's an arm's length away from actually a direct relationship with the provider. And so you really need to work with the Carasoft vendor to make sure that the terms and conditions that you're holding the provider to are within their contract. It was really a struggle here in the state of Maine through the Attorney General's office for me to convince them that we could do it this way, and that's just how software is sold these days, and it can be a challenge with you, and it's something that you should be thinking about in how you would prepare for those. Really making sure that the terms and conditions are stated in the purchase order is really important, because that's the only way you'll be able to hold Carasoft responsible, and you'll be hoping that Carasoft, for our example, would be able to hold Salesforce responsible. Finally, the last piece of advice that I would provide is really that focus around those purchases through the third parties, and trying to make sure that we had used the NASPO agreement as the base terms for the agreement, because lots of the cloud services providers will already have had some service level agreements within that document. However, what you'll find in a lot of the orders is that they'll want to put all of their terms and conditions as links. And of course, your Attorney General's offices may have concerns about the idea of you agreeing to links that could change afterwards. And it really is a large struggle with a lot of these service providers to try to get them to take their linked terms and conditions and actually create real terms and conditions out of them. So those are some things that you should be thinking about as you're going forward and paying attention to. So for example, you're not agreeing to something today that could change tomorrow, or oftentimes the links may link to other pages that may disagree with the terms and conditions you're negotiating. Specifically, if those generalized terms and conditions have things like no liability clauses. So those are some things that Maine learned in the last few weeks as we're doing our negotiations, and you can always reach out through the Children's Bureau to me. I'll be happy to have further conversations with any state that'd like more information. That's what I wanted to share. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Blanchard, for jumping on the line there. We'd like to take 10 seconds just to be sure there aren't any more questions as it relates to procurement. Please feel free to raise your hand, drop a question in the inbox, or just let us know that you'd like for us to unmute your line. We've got 2 more topics that we're going to talk through shortly. So just a quick 10-second pause. Any questions? Going once, going twice? Let's keep moving, Nick. So the next topic area is around implementation. And so I'd like to pose the first question to the state of Idaho. And Idaho, the question is number 2, what challenges did you experience, if any, in the actual installation and implementation of the solution?
Well, I guess this is Greg, goes back to our what Chris mentioned about phased approach. So I think the phased approach worked really well for the functional software. I will say that one of the most critical aspects, and it is related to question one, is the licensing. Understanding the licensing characteristics of your third-party products and your platform and if you have software as a service, and even with Microsoft, the Azure platform is different than the Dynamics 365. The licensing is a nightmare relative to the implementation schedule. What we have found is you pay for the highest level of use in any 12-month period of time, and if you're not careful, you're paying for 11 months of your full system when you don't have that system up in production. So in terms of implementation, one of the lessons is tie your licensing and the licensing strategies more carefully if you want to be thoughtful about what you're releasing, when you're releasing it, and paying for only what you're using. The other activities in terms of implementation, I think the idea of the legacy system synchronization has given us huge benefits, and maybe it's unique to our ability to move the data from our legacy system, and we do real-time transfers back and forth between those two systems. Really has done two things for us. It has allowed us to make smaller releases of code. It allows us to have a quality assurance check on the assumptions we've made with the data and how it behaves. Because if we can't map it to go back and forth between the two systems seamlessly, we don't know the data well enough to be doing some of our work. And we have had some great catches with serious errors that would have occurred that we would not have noticed in the functioning of our code if it had not been for the requirements to match the data between the two systems. Those would be the two quick things I would offer in terms of implementation challenges.
And Greg, please go ahead and make your suggestion around a slight language change as it relates to governance. I won't steal all your thunder, but please go ahead. Okay.
Well, this conversation and where we've been and trying to reflect on if we could do it all over again, and I think this was the comment that was made just a moment ago by the gentleman who joined us. There is a new thing that we have to manage in the governance framework, and that is partner or partnership governance. And it is, if you think about what you've done in putting out into this cloud environment, a new relationship with Microsoft, I will tell you that understanding how Microsoft as a partner is going to interact with us and the variety and levels of conversation is just incredibly large. Everything from feature sets to roadmaps to production level supports to EA agreements to the interactions of those EA agreements with other subcomponents within their system, and those cloud providers are huge. So we've started, we haven't moved very far, but establishing that our governance structure needs a partnership governance to allow us to effectively manage these entities we're now working with. And it's like a scale above working with a systems integrator like a Deloitte or an Accenture or someone who would come in and help you build that, because it's ongoing activities that are going to manage or control your lives in ways you don't know. And if you're not able to communicate and coordinate quickly with them, we've already stumbled a few times with some wave. Microsoft calls it a wave. They're software refreshes or changes or new features that they have coming in, and they've broken other things that we have created in some of our customization, which was really limited. So a new thing in that governance structure I think we need. We're working hard to create with our cloud provider, Microsoft. Thanks for giving me that moment, Nicole.
No, absolutely, Greg. That's a very, very important and key relationship. Linda and Jay in Arizona. I'd like to ask you the question as it relates to your PaaS, SaaS, and licenses that were originally procured, and if you've had to make any changes. Any thoughts about the licenses as procured and how it was implemented?
Yeah, I'll start off. And so I also empathize with Greg's predicament, if you will, about like the licensing cost and so forth. It is one of the reasons why, and I commend Bob and the use of a third party to manage the license. I can tell you, Arizona is not that mature to be able to have a relationship with a third party and negotiate that through the vendor, which was one of the reasons we picked the platform that we did. I can tell you it's not just about the licensing, it's really understanding the actual licenses that you need, how the portal license will work. And we were able to use our vendor to actually, meet with our vendor, Microsoft, to determine how do we best license this for Guardian year 1 through year 3 to 5. But it's not just about the license of PaaS and SaaS. It's also about the consumption of the services that you have. So while to me, your PaaS and SaaS, the licenses is predictable, and you can really have thoughtful conversations, if you do not understand how your services, those consumption things where you are paying for infrastructure as a service, am I paying on hits? How do I leverage these different services, and how am I going to be charged? You cannot have a predictable model of what the stuff will be and be able to go back to your legislation that says this is what I expect my cost to be. If you don't understand the consumption costs that you will have in Azure and be able to figure that out, or AWS, whatever, they're very similar. They're very similar in their in how they cost things out. That to me, it's not the licensing, it's the consumption. Jay, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I would agree with that, and I'd say in some respects it's both, because certain things inside Azure that you may decide to leverage certain infrastructure as a service, VMs as an example, and then also SQL as a service more on the SaaS and PaaS side. Your existing licenses can actually leverage how you use those in the cloud. And Microsoft is, listen, anybody that's dealt with Microsoft understands licensing is not an enjoyable subject when it comes to it, because they constantly change certain aspects about how things work, and you really have to keep up on it. So when you start looking at VMs, well, they have options to say, well, if you've paid for on, say you have an enterprise agreement, certain, we'll say CPUs, cores, for Windows Server, you can apply those to VMs that you create in the cloud and lower your consumption cost for those specific VMs. They're called hub licensing in the Microsoft land. When you build SQL PaaS as a service, you can apply your SQL on-prem licenses, depending on the type of SQL you're implementing, to do the same thing, hub-style licensing for SQL. So those existing licenses that you bought that you may not be needing on-prem anymore can still be leveraged for cloud-based resources. They also have, lots of options, and Amazon has the same things for things like reserved instances, stuff that's going to be on 24/7. You can prepay for those things. There's lots of options to look at each individual type of service and try to get that cost as maximized as possible for the consumption being used. And you do really have to understand every factor being done. When you look at a VM as an example, Microsoft will tell you that a 2-processor, 8 gig of RAM VM might cost you $108 a month for a 24/7 run. But what they don't include in that cost are things like extra storage that you attach to it, the backup costs that are associated to those things. What retention periods do you have for that data? Do you need external access? So now you need an external IP address assigned to that. All of those things tack on costs specific to that VM. And when you shut off the VM, it may stop accumulating costs, but those storage costs don't stop. The cost of that IP address doesn't stop. Those backup costs still run and are still sitting there in the back end. So you really need to understand the overall matrix of whatever cloud provider, whatever hosting model you decide to choose. you have to look at each individual thing that you're looking at building and say, what is the cost model for each individual aspect, understand it, and then try to maximize it, or else you will be bleeding money quickly.
Yep. Yeah, this is Chris in Idaho. Could not agree more. I mean, I think that we've talked about the consumption charges, right? The CPU utilization, but there's also what needs to be considered in that is the egress charges. So if you start to pull data from that Azure platform, you're paying for the bandwidth for the egress of that data from the Azure platform. So how you can, I mean, believe me, the visibility that you can get into what the charges are and the cost management that you can, the cost view that you can have is great, right? You know what you're paying for. But if you don't manage what it is that you're paying for, you can lose control of that quickly.
That's right. And that can also influence a lot of your architectural decisions. You know, do I really need to print that? Do I, you know, how do I exchange information between the platforms? And you want to be, as long as you understand how you're charged, you have a really good partnership with your vendor because they'll help you with this. But you have to understand everything is chargeable and everything is consumable. You have to understand your consumption costs. It's not just about the license.
Right, and that does go back to the partnership that was brought up before. And I'll bring up a specific example that Microsoft has again for their VMs of reserved instances. And basically, this again is prepaying for a VM, so you get a lower rate because you're guaranteeing Microsoft that you're going to have it up for a period of time. Well, Microsoft implemented this on the commercial side as they do first, and then rolled it in the government. The problem was initially when they rolled it in, is you had to buy these reserved instances either 1 year or 3 year services. And a lot of state governments had a problem prepaying for services this fiscal year that they're actually getting the next fiscal year. It's a weird thing you have to deal with. So Microsoft made an adjustment on the government side. So reserved instances actually could be billed out on a monthly basis. So you could properly do it, but they did it very silently. If they didn't really send out a big notification to people saying this was an option, and I had to find out about it through one of our Azure, Microsoft Azure partners that we get on a phone call with about every other week. And he informed me that says, hey, you can take advantage of reserved instance now, which allows you to do monthly billing and get the same cost of a 3 year implementation, but be billed monthly. So we can actually further reduce our overall charges and costs. So, I mean, cost management is great, but that partnership is what's going to allow you to understand those differences when they roll out of that cost management.
Excellent. Thank you. I think all of those points that both teams have put on the table are just invaluable lessons learned and information sharing for everyone who's thinking about jumping into cloud computing. So we're going to do a quick time check. We've got essentially, I think, 7 to 8 minutes left. Instead of moving on to user experience, we'd really like to close out with asking both states, and we'll start with Arizona. What was your biggest aha moment or the 1 or 2 big things that you would do differently so that states who are about to jump into cloud computing can give those aha moments some thought? We will circle back at some point in the future and think about having a very specific webinar around the user experience in cloud computing. But with that, Linda and Jay, your 1 or 2 big aha moments or things that you would have totally done different based on what you know now?
So I don't know if I have a ton of things that I would say I would completely do differently. I mean, everything is kind of sort of an evolution to get you to the point where you're at now. And I don't see anything that we've done necessarily as something I would completely reverse course on. But a lot of the aha stuff, I think, is to an extent been talked about already. Because when you move from an on-prem, I manage everything infrastructure, the rules that you deal with on-prem are very different and much more confined than the rules that you deal with in a hosted provider. Linda brought up a while back about data governance and bringing the business in to discuss retention periods for a specific type of data. This was always IT driven 99% of the time when things are on-prem, because IT buys a system that says, I have this amount of data retention in this system, in these storage racks in this data center. So business had to kind of conform to what IT told them to conform to in some respects. That's completely different in the cloud. You can have almost whatever retention you want as long as your budget allows for retaining whatever it is for that period of time. The option is there to do so. So having that business now come in and start working really with IT to build those options out is a massive difference. That when you're transitioning over, you have to understand a lot of those limitations, they're gone. The limitation now is your management of it, and obviously the budget behind it in terms of what you have the capability of doing.
And I will just add to that, on the IT and the technical side, if you think you have good service management, meaning incident, your ability to change, release management, be prepared to really evaluate your processes against being able to manage with that kind of fourth tier in that vendor role, when you are really working with your external vendors and that different tiered model. Be prepared to really look at your technical processes to make sure you can manage.
Thank you, Linda and Jay. Idaho, Greg and Chris?
Chris replies.
So
Your final thoughts?
I would say we have ahas every day, sometimes 2 or 3 a day. I like the idea from Arizona about the evolution. It is an evolution. If you all want to always be right and never be surprised, don't take this journey. It's about having the capacity to manage surprising things that you did not expect. But we've not had anything that broke our back or that was not solvable. We sometimes have to remind people that things are solvable and we can find a solution to it. It'll just be different than what we're used to. I would say that our project is a business driven. Our IT would not have wanted this change and would have stayed in the premise-based, control-based world they were in and saw no value in the cloud. But the interesting thing for my one thing I would have spent more time on, and I've mentioned it once before, is I would have modeled the way the system in its entirety would have functioned. And I would have locked ourselves in a room for a week or maybe 2 and really evaluated what this thing was we were building, so that we did not just recreate our legacy system in a new cloud-hosted space. And it's probably the thing I worry the most about these days. We're gonna deploy, and we're gonna be successful, and we're gonna be secure, and we will have our challenges with being affordable and new partnership governance with Microsoft. But fundamentally, if you're gonna build something, you should know enough about it that you can imagine what you need to do differently. And I don't think we did that as well as we could have. I did not know that we were lacking as much as we are today. And I think it's had an effect on our ability to build code, test code, evaluate code. And our goal was to have a better experience for Idaho families and children. And our goal was that social workers spent less time doing administrative tasks or managing things that the software should have done for them. And I think we missed on some of those points, not in a large way, but if I could do something different and ask other states, consider this, lock yourself in a room. If your business, you can kind of drive that. If your technology, it's begging them to come in and say, what is it that you really want? And don't bring just the people who know how to do the work. Bring people who can say, we are not successful at investigating neglect and abuse cases. We're not able to quickly move a child through the steps to get to permanency because these things stop us. And what could automation really do to help solve those problems so that we're building that solution not as a repeat of what the legacy system did, but as an opportunity for what this new technology can do for us.
Thank you very much, Greg. I think you totally wrapped it up with some of the very same key messages that we had in our wrap-up. So we'd like to thank everyone for attending today. Our upcoming March webinar on Thursday, March 26th is featuring technology and program collaboration, a model for project success. So thank you, Greg, for totally teeing that up for us for the month of March. And so with that, thank you to both the leaders on the Arizona and the Idaho project teams. Thank you to Mr. Blanchard for adding some commentary from the state of Maine. And of course, we'd like to thank all of our state participants today. Thank you and have a good day.